Well, we now have Mathew Frith talking to us about the theory of individuality in American Protectionists.
We get more different.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks everyone for being here. Okay, so the topic of today's presentation is the theory of individuality in American Protectionist thought. And what I mean by American Protectionist thought is I'm referring to that school of thought which originated with Alexander Hamilton and which remained active throughout 19th century America. Now I'm focusing on the theory of individuality, which refers to the idea that every individual is unique and possesses distinctive qualities. And for the American Protectionists, it goes even further than that. Individuality is something that's inherent and arises from natural differences in individual talents, aptitudes, and dispositions. And there's two reasons why I'm focusing on this topic. First, I seek to challenge the conventional narrative around the American Protectionists. The conventional narrative being is that these economists were basically using classical theory and accepted all the basic axioms of classical economics, but they happened to arrive at different policy conclusions concerning international trade. This simply isn't true in my view. The American Protectionists arrived at different policy conclusions precisely because they were operating under different axioms, which is perhaps best demonstrated by their theory of individuality. And it is from these axioms that they constructed a different and distinct system of economic theory, and this is what informed their policy conclusions. And economics as a science that deals with how individuals engage in production, distribution, and the exchange of goods and services. So there's arguably nothing more fundamental than the conception of the individual. And second, I'm also of the view that starting off with this assumption that individuals possess unique talents, aptitudes, and dispositions leads to a superior system of economic thinking to that of the classical economists and the schools of thought that evolved out of classical economics. Now that's the more controversial statement, so if I don't convince you of that, hopefully I'll correct the historical record concerning this important and misunderstood school of economic thought. Now to demonstrate how the conception of the individual differs between the classical economists and the American Protectionists, let's start by examining the classical conception. And it's perhaps best to start with the founder of classical economics, Adam Smith. So according to Smith, the difference of natural talents in different men is in reality much less than we are aware of. And the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions when grown up to maturity is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labour. The difference between the most dissimilar characters between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature. So here Adam Smith is denying or at least downplaying the fact that there's natural differences in individuals. He sees the individual as more or less homogeneous and uniform. In fact, many scholars, including the likes of Schumpeter, Dennis O'Brien, and even Murray Rothbard, they've argued that Adam Smith was a proponent of the blank slate view of human nature. And this blank slate view basically assumes that everyone is inherently the same and differences between different individuals arise from different experiences. Now this depiction of man as homogeneous and uniform only sped up under Ricardo. With Smith, there was still some recognition of individual differences resulting from different experience, even though there was nothing inherent or fundamental about it. This is even less the case with Ricardo. To quote Ricardo, it will be of little importance to examine into the comparative degree of estimation of the relative productiveness in which different kinds of labour are held. The variation is very inconsiderable. Now I admit that Ricardo is a very difficult writer, so this passage of course doesn't fully encapsulate this assumption of abstract and homogeneous labour units, but I don't imagine what I'm saying is actually all that controversial. I think most scholars of Ricardo would agree with this claim, that Ricardo treated labour as an undifferentiated input. Now, in contrast to the classical tradition of Smith and Ricardo, the American Protectionists viewed man as possessing a high degree of individuality and a diversity of natural talents, aptitudes, and dispositions. The following quote comes from Henry Charles Carey, who was the leader of the school in the mid-19th century. Now, whereas Smith downplays natural differences among individuals, Henry Carey explains that the distinctive feature of man is individuality. Each rat or robin, fox or wolf is a type of species wherever found, possessing habits and instincts in common. but such is not the case with man, in whom we find differences of taste, feelings, and capacities almost as numerous as those observed in human countenance. So a very different view of man to that of the classical economist. Man indeed possesses a high degree of individuality, according to Carey. There are natural differences in taste, instincts, aptitudes, and so forth. And this is something that's distinct and inherent to mankind. And this isn't an isolated view. This was a view shared by virtually every member of the school, as I hope to demonstrate over the coming slides. Now, to contrast the difference in the approach between the classicals and the American protectionists, it's good to look at the example of individual genius. If you recall, Adam Smith denied the existence of natural genius, or what appeared to be natural genius, and he argued that natural genius was purely the product of the division of labour. In contrast to Smith, we have the following quote from John Ray. According to Ray, genius is by many considered synonymous with learning. A refined and cultivated mind does not properly constitute genius, but it consists in a gift of nature. Education may embellish the mind, but there's something noble and majestic in a great natural genius. There is something divine in a true genius that rises the soul above itself and enables it to obtain objects beyond the sphere of intellect. So this explanation of genius almost seems to be the opposite of what Smith, the case made by Smith. Now, the American protectionists were also explicit in, calling out the Ricardian tendency of treating labour as an abstract and undifferentiated input. So Alexander Hill Everett explains, for example, that the labour of individuals is by no means a fixed quantity, but varies in their natural dispositions and with the motives that determine their conduct. We observe a remarkable difference in the activity and industry of different communities, of different persons in the same community, resulting from varieties of situation and character. I should note here, by the way, that Alexander Everett isn't actually going after Ricardo, he's actually responding to Malthus, but the implication remains the same. Francis Bowen does, however, respond to Ricardo, explaining that the great mistake of Ricardo and his followers, who have done so much to reduce political economy to a mere deductive science, all the conclusions in which are obtained by abstract reasoning from a few arbitrary premises, is that they generally treat of labour in the abstract and make no allowance for the differences in the quality of labour. Now, these are just some examples I've picked. There's numerous other cases of the protectionists basically criticising the classicals on this basis. Now, I mentioned previously that the American Protectionist school originated with Alexander Hamilton. In actual fact, Hamilton wasn't the only father of the school. In addition to Hamilton, there was also Tench Coxe and also William Barton. All of these thinkers knew one another and all worked in the US Treasury. So Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Then there was Tench Coxe was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. And Barton was Chief Clerk of the Treasury at the time. The other thing is, what a lot of people don't realise is actually the report on manufactures was actually co-authored with Tench Coxe. Now, what you find is that all the founding members of this school affirm this view of mankind. Hamilton explains in the report on manufactures that there is a diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another. Tench Coxe, you can actually find a draft of his report on manufactures, and interestingly, it's written quite differently to Hamilton, but it affirms the same idea. When the variety of human talent is duly remembered, there are those who have been peculiarly qualified by nature for the useful arts, and we should find the encouragement necessary to call forth their various talents. And Barton also explains that within each nation, a variety of genius, habits, and manners exists among each of their respective inhabitants. So I bring this to your attention to demonstrate that this theory of individuality and the diversity of natural talents was a feature of the school since its very conception. All right, now let's assess the claim that these protectionist writers were simply using classical theory but happened to arrive at different conclusions concerning trade. Now, what you find if you look at classical trade theory is it's predicated on the efficiency gains resulting from specialisation under free trade. It used to be the case under the theory of absolute as well as the theory of comparative advantage. Now it's very easy to see how one can jump from this blank slate view of human nature found in Adam Smith or the Ricardian treatment of undifferentiated inputs to the idea that nations should specialise in a particular industry or a narrow basket of industries under free trade. David Ricardo, for instance, argued that under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labour to such employments as are most beneficial to each. The pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole. And by using most efficaciously the peculiar powers bestowed by nature, he's talking about natural resource endowments here, it distributes labour most effectively. It is this principle which determines that wine shall be made in France and Portugal, that corn shall be grown in American Poland, and that hardware and other goods shall be manufactured in England. Now you'll notice that in the passage, Ricardo states that labour will be distributed to the most efficient area of production, not because of the individual features of the labourers themselves, but on the basis of natural resource endowments. Now this is perfectly reasonable and even desirable if you assume that everyone is a blank slate or that labour is a homogeneous and uniform factor of production. If we assume that everyone is essentially the same, it doesn't really matter if you specialise in just one industry or a narrow basket of industries, since the nation's labourers will become accustomed to whatever sort of production the theory of comparative advantage dictates. There's no natural inclination for labourers to pursue other employments, or better yet, no productivity gains for individuals undertaking congenial pursuits. So this brings me to perhaps the most underappreciated argument presented by Hamilton and Cox in the Report on Manufactures. In contrast to the implications of classical trade theory, Hamilton argues that as to furnishing greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another, the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper object fall below mediocrity and labour without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. It is hence to be inferred that the results of human exertion, he's talking about production, may be immensely increased by diversifying its objects, so diversifying employments in industry. When all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and can call into activity the whole vigour of its nature. There is in the genius of the people of this country a peculiar aptitude for mechanic improvements. It would operate as a forceful reason for giving opportunities to exercise that species of talent by the propagation of manufactures. So Hamilton in 1791 argues that a diversified economy accommodates the diversity of natural talents, aptitudes and dispositions. It allows individuals to seek out employments which are best suited to their unique abilities and qualities, and allows them to exercise their talents and maximise their individuality. So right away, workers are pursuing more meaningful employment. But equally important, Hamilton notes that specialisation is actually harmful to economic welfare. As he said, there are those with peculiar talents and aptitudes who will fall below mediocrity if confined to uncongenial pursuits. So what you want, according to Hamilton, is a diversified economy. And generally speaking, this was actually the main argument given by members of this American Protectionist school in support of protective tariffs. The infant industry argument comes up, and of course this is important because you need to first foster those infant industries so you have a diversified economy. But what you find is that virtually every American protectionist after Hamilton, they actually supported a permanent tariff to facilitate and maintain economic diversification. So they weren't just advocates of infant industry protection. So we looked at Ricardo, let's briefly return to Smith. So we have the famous quote from Adam Smith: if a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we can ourselves, better buy it of them. Now, against this view, that we should simply buy where cheapest, we have the following quote from Francis Bowen, which I think provides a good juxtaposition. It's wasteful, to say the least, to allow mechanical skill and inventive genius to remain unemployed, as it would be to permit water power to run without turning mills, to give full scope to all the varieties of taste, genius and temperament, to foster inventive talent, to afford adequate encouragement to all the arts. These are objects which deserve at least as much attention as the inquiry of where we can purchase calicos cheapest. And I think this contrast, it seems to clearly stem from this differing conception of the individual. You know, if everyone's the same, it doesn't really matter where you're buying your commodities from, so buy where cheapest. But if we assume that there are these differences, then inventive genius and those talents and those things will remain dormant if the nation fails to industrialise. Now, just to further demonstrate this, I won't read all of these, I might just read the first two. I have the and this is just to demonstrate how widespread this was, just to demonstrate that they were a school of thought which kind of evolved around this idea. I have the following quote from Rufus Coate: "In a country of few occupations, employments go down by arbitrary, hereditary, coercive designation, without regard to the peculiarities of individual character, but a diversified, advanced and refined mechanical and manufacturing industry cooperating with numerous other employments offers the widest choice. It detects the slighter shades of individuality, quickens into existence and trains in perfection the largest and utmost possible variety of mind. Likewise, as Rosseman comments, that the faculties of mankind are almost infinitely various, so as to adapt men to a great variety of pursuits. Some constitutions produce intellectual faculties best adapted to particular pursuits, while the different constitutions of other persons tend to adapt their faculties to very different pursuits. The peculiarities which adapt a person to the highest degree of excellence in one field can make him unfit for many others." And we have another quote from Erastus B. Bigelow, but I'll let you read that if you need more convincing. So I think this really drives home the point that in order to accommodate the diversity of natural talents and to have the fullest expression of individuality, economic diversification is required. As Coate states, economic diversification detects the slighter shades of individuality, and they basically argued that in order to foster this diverse array of economic pursuits, you need to have a broad system of protective tariffs. Now on this point, I think it's important to emphasise that the American Protectionists were not in favour of developing manufacturing to the exclusion of other industries. They were, of course, in favour of developing manufacturing, hence why Hamilton called it the Report on Manufactures, but the goal was not to specialise in manufacturing or to specialise in a particular manufacturing industry. This is perhaps best put by Andrew W. Young, who explains that in every discussion of this subject, it is erroneously assumed by opponents of protection that its object is to promote the manufacturing interest in particular. Protectionists, on the contrary, hold to a community of interest. They believe that the labour of the country should be diversified and that the production of all commodities should be encouraged. The reasons for favouring this diversity of human industry are first that not all men are that men are not all fitted by inclination or natural faculty for the same pursuit. So what you call one, according to protectionists, is a diversified economy where you have all the different kinds of manufacturing, agricultural and service sector industries. In fact, many of their other arguments, not discussed in this presentation, many of their other arguments in favour of protectionism have nothing to do with manufacturing. They're actually arguments for protecting agriculture. And even if you look at the Report on Manufactures, while Hamilton criticises the claim made by physiocrats that agriculture is the sole possessor of productiveness and Smith's claim of the superiority of agriculture, in its place, Hamilton doesn't actually posit that manufacturing is superior to agriculture. In fact, what Hamilton says is it's extremely probable, on the ground of fact and calculation, that there is no material difference between the aggregate productiveness of the one, agriculture, and of the other kind of industry, manufacturing, and that encouragements which may be proposed to be given to either ought to be determined upon considerations relative to any comparison of that nature. And I would infer that given Hamilton's broader views on this matter, that the productiveness is more dependent on who is engaged in the particular pursuit than something inherent to the pursuit itself, and that's why productiveness of agriculture and manufacturing are viewed as largely equivalent in aggregate terms. And now this is also actually part of the, underpins why protectionists rejected what would now be called strategic industrial policy. By and large, the American Protectionists, they favoured a broad system of protective tariffs in order to make the economy as a whole more conducive to entrepreneurship and the cultivation of a wide array of different economic pursuits. But they didn't support the targeting of particular industries through the likes of subsidies and other forms of special privilege. In fact, they were often highly critical of subsidies in many contexts. In any event, I think this demonstrates that the conventional narrative surrounding the American Protectionists is mistaken. The American Protectionists were operating with a different conception of the individual to that of the classical economists, and this is what led them to arrive at different policy conclusions surrounding international trade. In fact, I would even argue that the classicals and the protectionists actually differed far more substantially when it came to theory and first principles than they actually did when it came to economic policy. Now, I would just like to say before my talk that this emphasis on individuality actually shaped their entire economic system. For this talk, I've focused mainly on international trade. And I couldn't elaborate on it for the sake of time, but they developed a theory of agglomeration, which was predicated on individuality. If you look at their theory of the business cycle, it also is shaped by this emphasis on individuality and their views on growth more broadly. Anyway, I'll leave it there and hand it over to the Q&A.
Another